Built during the Great Depression and funded by all three levels of government, the Broadway Bridge was a relief project intended to provide work for unemployed married men in Saskatoon. Construction began with excavations for Pier No. 1 on the downtown riverbank on December 15, 1931. The bridge opened to traffic on November 11, 1932. In between, 1,593 men worked on the project, earning a total of $324,000, or about $200 each. They worked in shifts, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, without pause through rain, wind, and blizzard through Christmas and holidays. The city hired Len Hilliard, a local commercial photographer, to document the project in a series of photographs and this short film. In 1963, city engineer E.J. Cole wrote a short narrative for the film, from which this script is adapted. The photographs, film, and Ernie Cole's narrative are all at the City of Saskatoon Archives. We begin sometime in early 1932 with Harold McIver Weir, assistant city engineer. It's impossible to say for certain who these others are, wandering around in front of the field offices on Spadina Crescent, where Friendship Park is today. Even the identity of this fellow here with the pipe remains a mystery, despite the considerable amount of screen time he gets. Instead, we have to wait for the arrival of R.J. Arend, Jim to his friends, the general contractor on the Broadway Bridge project. Next up is Jack Mackenzie, the engineer in charge of the design, who was Dean of Engineering at the University of Saskatchewan and clearly a playful fellow. Construction began on December 15th and went on at a furious pace. By mid-February, Piers 1 and 2, counting from the downtown side, were finished. This catwalk was for men moving the huge wheelbarrows full of concrete from the mixing shed on the downtown side to whichever pier was being poured. Next up, we have the dapper Wally Foss, resident engineer on the project for the City of Saskatoon. And this is a homemade steam hoist designed and built by R.J. Arend especially for this job, using a portable steam engine he'd bought and a salvage tractor wheel to hold the turning gear for the base. Here's the hoist in action, probably in the excavation for Pier No. 3. Whenever they could, the work was done by hand so as to squeeze as many man-hours out of the project as possible. Here, men are shoveling mud into the hoist buckets. The men doing the actual grunt work on this project were all unemployed married men. During the Great Depression, unemployment relief of most kinds was limited to married men. If you were single or a woman, you were mostly out of luck when it came to relief. Reportedly, the only single man on the bridge project was Howard Douglas, an engineer employed by Arend. Next, we have Wally Foss with Merv Carson, a surveyor who worked for the City of Saskatoon. Probably what they're doing here is pumping water out of one of the excavations. And this is R.B. McLeod, a local contractor, along with an assortment of dignitaries, including the Mayor of Saskatoon, Ed Underwood, himself an engineer. Here's another shot of our Arend, the general contractor, followed by George Wheaton in his trademark cap, who worked for Arend. Next up is John McDougall, a city councillor who sat on the Public Works Committee, and he's followed by Rupert Wentz of Wentz's Lumber, which supplied the 1.5 million feet of lumber used in the construction. Now here we see the steam pile driver pounding down the sheet piles for one of the cofferdams. Clearly, the site was awash with touring dignitaries on this particular day, most of them unidentifiable, but probably city councillors and local businessmen. One familiar face here, Mr. James Stevenson with his wife. Stevenson was a well-known Saskatoon lawyer and at that time president of the Board of Trade. And here's Jim Tucker, who also sat on City Council, followed by Stevenson again, and finally by John East, founder of John East Ironworks in Saskatoon, who appears to have a great deal to say. Next up, we've got scenes showing the excavation and pouring of one of the piers. This is the part the arches rest on it, and it begins with the building of a cofferdam to divert the water around the construction area, then the digging of a deep excavation all the way into the dense, rocky till that lies below the riverbed, and the building of forms to pour the concrete into. Here we see men working down inside the form for Pier No. 3 as the concrete begins to flow. And we know the precise date for this, in fact, February 26, 1932. Here the men are pouring concrete from wheelbarrows down the chutes into the form. As the work progresses, the form will be built up higher and higher until it looks like this, the form around the completed Pier No. 4, with Nutana in the background. Hoardings were built around the forms and steam was pumped into them to keep the concrete from freezing while it set during the winter. Here the camera has moved on to Pier 4 and is looking back to No. 3, where they are still busily pouring concrete. It took about 20,000 cubic yards of concrete to build the Broadway Bridge. not including the sidewalks and other construction on either side of the riverbanks. It was all hauled by men with wheelbarrows. 20,000 cubic yards is a lot of wheelbarrows. Here we are looking back toward Nutana. You can see the completed cofferdam where a new pier will soon be built. Above that, to the right, is a series of descending culverts which mark the path of an extensive drainage system that was being built to help stabilize the riverbank and prevent erosion. At the top of the bank, you can just see a streetcar making the turn down the long hill where it will cross over the traffic bridge and into downtown. Here you can see workers studying the steel reinforcing bars for the arches on one of the piers, probably number 4. Here we see water being pumped out of a cofferdam. They did sometimes leak. Pier 3 caused particular problems. The cofferdam around it broke 13 times before they were finished, setting the construction for that pier back considerably. Here's another look at the steam hammer driving cofferdam sheet piling. Note the lack of ear protection on the part of the fellow working the steam hammer, not what you'd see on a work site today. The cofferdams were made of 2 concentric rings of 6 by 12 wooden planks driven deep into the riverbed, with the space between them filled with dense, waterproof clay. We've jumped ahead now to later in the spring of 1932. Between March and June, flooding made it nearly impossible to work on the river crossing spans, so work shifted to the approaches on the riverbanks. The camera is panning across the bridge from the downtown side. Here you can see a view across to Nutana, and this is the old Cardinal Crescent rink, home of the Saskatoon Quakers, which was torn down to make way for the bridge roadways on the downtown side. It was replaced some years later by the arena rink in River Landing. Now we're looking across the line of piers to Nutana and the old water tower behind the fire hall where the hose and hydrant is now. The nearly completed north approach span with the completed first arch ring. There was severe flooding that year, with the water peaking on June 8th at a height of 23 feet within inches of the tops of the piers. June 8th was the only day on which work on the Broadway Bridge halted. In those days, the South Saskatchewan River experienced significant changes in height and speed over the course of the year. The building of the Saskatoon Weir at 33rd Street in 1939, which broadened the stream and slowed it down as it passed through the city, and, more significantly, the Gardner Dam in the 1960s, went a long way toward taming this part of the South Saskatchewan, while waste heat from the Queen Elizabeth Power Plant, which was built in the 1950s, ensured that the river here would never freeze solid again. And just to give you more of an idea of the height of the flood, you can see here that the river has completely inundated the catwalk that the men were using to pour cement. We've jumped ahead considerably now to the middle of October 1932. The bridge is nearing completion. The arches and decorative balustrades are finished, and crews are busy laying the streetcar tracks and constructing the light standards. There were record low temperatures that October of 1932. For 3 days and 4 nights, crews had to run hot water over the newly poured parts of the bridge decking to keep it from freezing while it set. The sidewalks were covered with tar paper and a layer of hot sand to keep them from freezing, while the concrete handrails were wrapped in tar paper and insulated with manure. A double row of streetcar tracks was added to the bridge to connect Nutana with the downtown. Here you can see a truck dumping asphalt, which is raked out and then leveled with a steamroller. This part of the work was done by the City of Saskatoon Engineering Department. The concrete for the bridge deck was poured about the 18th of October, and the asphalt work was done about October 24th, which, Ernie Cole tells us, is quite late in the season for this kind of work. The decision to move the streetcar line to the Broadway Bridge was made relatively late, in the summer of 1932. The old streetcar line across a narrow traffic bridge, with its sharp bend at the Nutana end and the relatively steep grade up the long hill, had always been a problem, and it was with great relief that we welcomed the new route, which went into service in the summer of 1933. Moving beneath the bridge, we see the catwalk running the length of the falsework, which was still up beneath the central arches. Here we see city engineer George Archibald with Jim Arend and the always well-dressed Wally Foss in breeches and high boots. Another view of the underside of the arches. Looking through the lines of the arches toward the Nutana side, you can see a team of horses doing some scraper work. The falsework was built out of fir and spruce trees cut in northern Saskatchewan. 130,000 feet of timber was used for one arch alone. Afterwards, the lumber was sawn into stove lengths and sold as firewood, which recouped much of the costs. Although Ernie Cole's narrative identifies some of the men in these next couple of sequences, it's impossible to tell who is who with any certainty, unfortunately. although this is certainly George Wheaton and Jack Mackenzie, but we have no idea who this is. Shy, whoever he was. And this looks like Jim Arend. And this has been identified as Jim Arend and a Mr. Henry Switzer walking toward Arend's Ford coupe, which drives off following the arrival of Dr. C.J. Mackenzie in his car. Here we see workers erecting the decorative light standards on the bridge. This is followed by the view from the downtown end of the bridge sometime in late October or early November. From left to right, Howard Douglas, Jim Arend, Mayor Underwood, Wally Foss, and Dr. C.J. Mackenzie. Here they are again. Douglas was later head of the Department of Civil Engineering at the University of Saskatchewan. And here, with the work nearing its end, a very cheerful Dr. Mackenzie. Building sidewalk forms on one of the approaches. The fellow with the hammer here is James A. Meldrum, one of the few laborers identified, a carpenter who might have been a foreman on the project. Finally, the bridge as it was at the end of October, with the false work still in place on the two central spans. The bridge opened to traffic at 11:30 a.m. on November 11, 1932, just after the Remembrance Day ceremony. Although there was still work to be done on the approaches, the bridge itself was complete and ready for use.